Okay, so we've got quite a bit to unpack today with this situation with Russia and Ukraine.
Absolutely.
And, folks out there have provided us with a ton of sources on what is clearly a very, very complex situation.
Yeah, it really is.
And what we're going to try to do today is cut through some of the fog and see if we can pull out some of the biggest takeaways and potential future pathways that these sources kind of point to.
Yeah, and
Sure, I can do.
especially with these talks, between the U.S. and Russia and the U.S. and Ukraine, seeming to go nowhere.
Right.
It's one source even calls it, fraught with tough choices.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment.
I think so.
So, one thing that really jumped out at me in looking through all this material is what looks like a pretty clear shift in how the U.S. wants to approach things strategically.
Oh yeah.
There's a lot here that suggests the U.S. really wants to see Europe step up more.
Yeah, take more of the lead in helping Ukraine.
Exactly, like take on more of the burden so the U.S. can focus on like the Middle East and the Pacific.
Yeah.
Which, I mean, I guess it makes sense from their perspective,
Yeah,
but it raises a huge question.
for sure.
What does this mean for Europe? Can they really get their act together and be decisive?
Right, because can they actually fill that void?
Exactly. And then, does this inadvertently telegraph a weakening of the Western alliance?
That's the big question, isn't it?
It is a big one.
Yeah.
And then, speaking of Europe, what's interesting is one potential response that keeps coming up in these sources
Yeah.
is this idea of a secure zone
Mm.
in Western Ukraine. If Russia, ends up solidifying control east of the Dnieper River.
Yeah, like if that's just the reality on the ground,
Yeah,
they're saying, okay, well, maybe we can secure the West,
right.
but that is not without major risk.
No, it is not. And actually, your sources point out that could lead to a huge escalation of this whole thing.
Like a huge, huge escalation.
And then on top of that, we have to consider President Trump.
Yeah,
He seems to be getting pretty frustrated.
understandably so.
Yeah, with these ceasefire talks going nowhere. And he's now talking about energy sanctions on major U.S. trading partners.
Like India and China.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking massive trade volumes here.
Yeah.
Like 119.1 billion with India and 582.4 billion with China.
Wow.
So it's clear the U.S. is walking a really tight economic tightrope here.
For sure. A real balancing act.
And, he's supposed to be talking with Putin soon.
Yeah.
But who knows what'll come out of that.
Yeah, that's a big question mark.
Okay, so let's try to get a handle on the actual military situation on the ground. What are we looking at here?
Well, from what your sources indicate, Russia's operations are pretty much all across the board,
Okay.
starting from Kursk all the way down through Luhansk, Donetsk,
Mm-hmm.
Zaporizhia, and they're even talking about taking Kherson and Odessa.
Wow, so they're definitely not backing down.
Not even a little bit.
But to be fair, Ukraine is not just sitting there taking it.
No, yeah, not.
There are reports they've actually made some gains in Russia's Belgorod region.
Yeah, which is south of Kursk, right?
Right,
So it's interesting. Why are they doing that?
right. What's the strategy there?
Your sources suggest a couple possibilities.
Okay.
Maybe they're trying to pull Russian forces away from more important spots.
Makes sense.
Yeah, like around Pokrovsk, or
Oh, I see.
could be a way to strengthen their hand in future negotiations.
Interesting.
Kind of reminds me of what they tried to do near Kursk a while back.
Right, but that didn't really pan out.
No, not really.
And, speaking of this Belgorod situation, these sources actually mention some very specific locations.
Oh, yeah, like Popovka,
Yeah, and,
Demidovka, and they even named the brigade involved.
oh, wow.
The 17th Heavy Mechanized Brigade.
Okay, so now things could really get interesting.
How so?
Well, there's talk about France and the UK getting more directly involved.
Oh, really?
Yeah, potentially sending air and naval forces to Ukraine.
Wow.
And apparently there's a scouting mission already happening.
That's big,
It is, but it's risky.
especially with those Russian air defenses.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Some areas are no-go zones.
Like Odessa, especially.
Yeah, and you have to wonder if Putin would just scrap the Black Sea grain deal altogether if European naval forces got involved.
Oh, absolutely. That's a real possibility.
And then, there's this whole idea of Europe offering Western Ukraine a security guarantee.
Like if Kiev falls.
Yeah, but it doesn't sound like everyone's on board with that.
No, especially Poland. They seem pretty reluctant.
Right. And the sources are clear, just sending planes and ships wouldn't be enough.
You'd need boots on the ground.
Exactly. And that puts countries like Poland and Romania right in the line of fire.
Yeah. Talk about a tough position to be in.
So what's the end game here for Russia? What are they really after?
Well, it seems pretty consistent across these sources.
Okay.
They want territory inside Ukraine, and they want a pro-Moscow government in charge.
So basically, regime change.
Basically, yeah. And they seem determined to get it, even with NATO saying their economy is stretched thin.
Yeah, that's a big gamble.
It is a huge gamble.
And it really puts President Trump in a bind if these peace talks don't go anywhere.
Totally. I mean, what are his options?
Yeah, because the sanctions so far haven't really done much.
And they could end up hurting the U.S. economy, too.
Right, and then you have this whole balancing act with China.
Which the Pentagon sees as like the main priority, right?
Yeah.
Containing China.
Yeah, and then the Middle East is still a powder keg.
Oh,
So it's tough to see how this plays out for Ukraine.
it really is. They're kind of caught in the middle of all this.
So I guess the big question coming out of all this is, if these negotiations fail, what are the options for the U.S. and Europe?
Yeah, is it escalate or recalibrate?
Right, double down or back off.
Exactly.
And, thinking about all this, something you said earlier really stuck with me.
What's that?
This idea of how interconnected everything is. Like we were talking about those huge trade numbers between the U.S. and China and the U.S. and India.
Yeah.
So I got to ask, how does a regional conflict like this, in Ukraine, end up affecting other parts of the world?
Yeah, like what are the ripple effects?
Right, because it's not like things happen in isolation.
No, not at all. In today's world, everything is connected.
Absolutely. So that's something for everyone out there to think about. How might this impact things you wouldn't even expect?
That's a good question, and I don't think anyone has the answer yet.
Yeah, that's what makes this whole situation so fascinating and so unsettling.
And that's why we got to keep digging for more information
Exactly, so we can try to make sense of it all.
and make informed decisions.
Right, because this stuff matters.
It matters a lot.
Thanks for joining us today on The Deep Dive,
My pleasure.
and we'll see you next time.
See you then.